I think what the hoax did to myself and many millions of others, I think, is it opened our eyes to how badly corrupted the institutions really are. Of course, I've always hated the media. I mean, as long as I can remember. Of course, I always knew they lie about everything and so on and so forth. But I had no idea.
Not all of us, Hans. Not all of us. Welcome back to Going Rogue with Lara Logan. My guest for this episode is a man I have been following for quite some time. One of the things that I have not gotten over is the Russia collusion conspiracy. And the reason for that is the same people behind Russia collusion were also behind the stealing of the 2020 election. They were behind, many significant offense, especially acts of deception and information warfare. And they have yet to be held to account, which millions of Americans are unhappy about, because as long as you leave these people to do what they do, they just keep doing it again. Subverted President Trump the first time around, they're subverting him again. So we have this sort of endless cycle. If you really want to understand what happened with the Russia conspiracy that was created to undermine a legally elected president, then Hans Mahncke, and I hope I said that correctly, is a very significant person for you. He wrote an amazing book that documented the what exactly happened in this conspiracy and lays out who some of the key people are. But Hans, one of the things that I want to jump right into it, because I've been waiting for this interview for quite some time, and I don't want to waste any time. So tell me this. What is it that people still don't know about the Russia conspiracy that you think is still the most relevant right now?
Overall, I would say the fact that everything was made up. Everything.
Yes.
Everything was made up. I think that I don't think has sunk in kind of broadly enough. People might think, oh, well, they made up this or that. No, they made up everything. But specifically, I think there is one story that very few people, even sort of on the right, Trump supporters and so on, don't know, which is that you remember there was that Steele Dossier. In the first few years of Trump-Russia collusion was all about this Steele Dossier that accused Trump.
The Steele Dossier. Christopher Steele, the British spy, right? Former British spy that everyone said was so credible.
That's right. And he accused Trump of the pee tape. He peed on some prostitutes in Moscow, and he had a collusion going on with Putin going back 8 years and on, just stories after stories after stories. That's the Steele Dossier. So the public didn't know that Steele, Christopher Steele, the guy who wrote that thing, was a Clinton operative. He was a Clinton paid operative. We only found that out through Kash Patel, the current FBI director, who was the lead investigator in the House into this whole thing. Now, the thing that people don't know, which, I mean, I'm just as I'm telling the story now, I'm shocked all over again, is that the media knew that Christopher Steele was a Clinton operative the whole time. They knew it during the 2016 election campaign. They knew it when this whole Russiagate started. They knew it when the whole Mueller inquisition started. All this time that the public did not know, they knew.
So let's break down then what is it exactly that the media did. They took this document, the Christopher Steele Dossier, as it was called. They all said it was unverified, right? As if that justified them. Now they were covered. This is what I call CYA journalism, cover your ass journalism. If you say it's unverified, then you can't be held to account for what's in the document, right? Even though you're publishing it as if it and treating it as if it's 100% verified, but you've covered yourself. In this dossier, they used it to create the appearance of an underhanded, treasonous relationship between Donald Trump and the president of a foreign nation, in this case, Russia. And they knew that the main source of that document was a paid political operative who was being paid by the opposition political candidate from the presidential election, who had just lost.
That's perfectly put. But it's even worse than that. They knew that he was a paid operative of the Clinton campaign before she lost. what happened is that the Clinton campaign paraded they flew him into Washington, D.C. Again, few people know that, in the summer of 2016. So in July, he arrived in Washington, D.C. And then the Clinton campaign took him into various news offices. They took him to the Washington Post and sat him down inside the Washington Post's office and said, oh, here's Christopher Steele. He's going to tell you about Russia collusion. And they did that to various other outlets in the summer of 2016. And that to me is always sort of, again, I shouldn't be surprised because I wrote a book about it. But again, every time I tell the story, it just hits me again how terrible that is, because after the whole Steele thing then kind of went mainstream in terms of went public, and by the way, that was Jake Tapper from CNN who was the first to push that out. And after all that happened, the media pretended that this was just some guy, some British agent, and never told us that this was a Clinton operative until a year later when it was Kash Patel who found that out through bank records, which he had to subpoena.
You're absolutely right that even though we know this, even though you're saying it now out loud, it does really deserve a moment to pause and think about what that really means. So you're in the midst of a presidential election. You have one candidate in that election flies in a political operative from the UK, by the way, and they bring him in with this dossier that is obviously salacious and fake. It doesn't have a single firsthand source in it. And they don't tell the public. They treat this and they publish this and they treat it as if it is genuine, when they know perfectly well that it is completely and utterly tainted. Because and there's how many laws in the United States did that break just doing that?
I didn't count, but it's absolutely horrendous what they did. And again, that it's not speculation. It's not us thinking that maybe they knew or whatever. No, we know this. We know that he was paraded to all these media outlets. So even if they claim they don't, how do they know what's in the dossier and whether he got it right or not? Well, they can say that, but what they cannot say is that they didn't know he was a Clinton operative.
Well, they also didn't make it public.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is when they reported on this, they didn't say how they were introduced to Christopher Steele. They didn't say that he came to them via the Clinton campaign. That would have changed everything for the public. If Donald Trump had done the same thing, if he had flown in, a former British spy who said that Hillary Clinton had been, doing salacious things in a foreign country, they would have put that in the articles, wouldn't they?
Oh, for sure. Then they would have used it to absolutely trash Donald Trump for doing that.
And then on top of that, they gave themselves Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting.
Which, by the way, Trump is still suing to have revoked, which is one of those highly endearing things about him where a lot of people might say, well, forget about it, who cares or whatever. I love the fact that he's still pursuing them exactly for that, because you're absolutely right. It's such an important thing that not only did they lie, concealed, and basically colluded with, not even basically, they colluded with the Clinton campaign to keep all this secret, both during the election and then after when Mueller came after Trump. But as you say, worst of all, then they went, maybe not worst of all, but kind of cherry on top, they gave themselves prizes for doing that. So I look forward to the day when those prizes get revoked.
Well, this is about something other than, vengeance, for example, or retribution, right? This is about honesty. This is about the truth, is that your prize doesn't mean anything if you literally give it to people for a story that was completely and utterly made up. And, there's no shortage of journalists who like to point out that that with my reporting on Benghazi, there was a source in the story who was supposed to have lied. And so they love to drag that up and throw that in my face. But here you have people whose entire story was fabricated, and not for 1 year, but for more than 1 year. They kept awarding each other prizes for their reporting. Things that they already knew when they wrote it were not true.
Absolutely. And of course, there are many, many perpetrators in this crime. Starting with the Clinton campaign, the Clinton operatives, Christopher Steele, Obama, Biden, it's a long list. But in terms of the media, I always kind of attach special culpability because they're the ones who are supposed to tell us the truth about it. Obama,
Right.
Yeah, we expect him to lie about these things or try and prop up Hillary or whatever. You almost expect these kinds of things. But the media is not supposed to do that. And that's why I always kind of attach attach a special kind of anger and frustration with what they did.
Well, the Clinton campaign knew that the media would be willing participants, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you have to start this conversation. How is it that the Clinton campaign could be so certain that members of the media would not expose them for what they were doing, would not question what they were doing, and then would go along with it? This is because basically this was a massive deception. They got Christopher Steele to create a fake document that was meant to be both an embarrassment and an indictment of Donald Trump, and was meant to alter the results of the 2020 election. But not just that. If you look at it, they were busy with this when they knew that they were going to cheat in 2016, they were pretty sure they were going to win that election because they barely campaigned. Even there were even Democrats who commented on the fact that Hillary Clinton barely campaigned. And so what was their real purpose? I mean, they were planning on using this against Donald Trump to make sure that he never ran again. Think about it. Every dollar you spend either supports your values or works against them. And in today's economy, where you spend your money really matters. That's how we take back our country. Patriot Mobile is leading the way as America's only Christian conservative wireless provider. Switch today without sacrificing quality or service. And you'll get exceptional nationwide coverage. You know why? Because unlike other providers, Patriot Mobile utilizes all 3 major U.S. networks. They can even add 2 numbers on 2 networks on one phone, something the big guys can't do. So stay connected with flexible, unlimited data plans, mobile hotspots, international roaming, device protection, and internet backup. Best of all, switching to Patriot Mobile supports faith, family, and freedom. And if you believe in our First and Second Amendment rights, the sanctity of life, and supporting our veterans, this is where you belong. Switching is simple. Keep your number, keep your phone, or upgrade. Patriot Mobile's 100% US-based team will activate you in minutes. Right now, go to patriotmobile.com/Lara or call 972-PATRIOT. Get a free month of service with promo code LARA. That's LARA. Switch today. That's patriotmobile.com/Lara or call 972-PATRIOT.
Absolutely. And you're so right about the fact that they could only parade Christopher Steele to all these journalists if they already knew that the journalists would, keep that fact quiet, and then just talk about the dossier, and not the fact that who wrote the dossier and that guy was being paid by the Clinton campaign. There are some emails that came out over the years through lawsuits and this and that. And so they are beyond these news organizations like Washington Post as a whole or ABC as a whole. There are very specific people whom they had on board. Now, it's never been proven whether these people got paid journalists by the Clinton campaign. At least I haven't been able to prove that. But the communications are very deliberate and very personal and very direct in terms of the Clinton operatives telling these journalists, you got to run this story, you got to do it then, you got to do that. I mean, there's a lot of interaction there that we can prove happened. Another thing that happened is that ABC ran they had a clip that the Clinton campaign wanted for one of their ads. And but they never aired the clip. Well, lo and behold, on the morning they aired the clip, it immediately went out as a Clinton campaign ad, part of that clip. You can see the overlap. So there's no way, of course, that the Clinton campaign would have been able to create that ad, within 5 minutes. So again, there was coordinated. This was George Stephanopoulos, by the way, ABC, right? So again, we can prove that there was collusion coordination between the media and the Clinton campaign in real time.
So ABC News has a clip that the Clinton campaign wants to use in an ad. It has never been out on air, so they quickly put it out that morning as a cover, really, for giving it to the campaign to use in their ad.
That's exactly what happened.
The level of business amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars that he received as a result of interaction with Russian businessmen.
Hundreds of millions of dollars from Russian businessmen.
Correct.
Trump made millions.
And who was involved besides George Stephanopoulos? Who are the Clinton operatives we're talking about, and who are the journalists we're talking about?
So on the ABC side, there was a guy called Brian Ross who later got fired because of some false reporting about General Michael Flynn. But he had his hands all over the 2016 campaign in terms of colluding with the Clinton campaign constantly. He did something really horrific. I mean, did many horrific things, but one that keeps coming back to my mind is he smeared an innocent man. He set him up to be sort of a stooge in this whole thing. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but just to give an outline of how horrible
we should
it
get
is.
into the weeds. The devil is in the details. You can tell us.
Just to illustrate how absolutely horrific it is what these people did. So, Christopher Steele put a totally innocent American man into his dossier and claimed that this man was the source for everything. He was the source for the P-tape story, and he was the source for the collusion going back 8 years, and he was the source for all these horrible things that Trump and Putin were doing. And so that it was all completely made up. And the man they had picked out, or that Christopher Steele had picked out, is called Sergei Milyan. He's an American citizen who originally came from Belarus. So he's not even Russian. That's sort of the cherry on top here. 20, 30 years ago, long time ago. And he was involved with the Russian-American Chamber of Commerce, and that was kind of the hook. We're going to go after him because there's something.
There's
to
a
do
link
with
to Russia. We can tie him and make him look guilty.
Correct. He had never had any contact with anyone in the Clinton campaign, with anyone in any Clinton operatives, with Steele, he just imagine just some guy who just doing his job, knows nothing about anything, and suddenly he shows up in the dossier as this big source. And it was all completely made up. And this is where ABC comes in. So ABC News tricked this man, Sergei Milyan, into coming into their New York studio to record a video, an interview about Russia in general and real estate and just these kind. By the way, the guy's a realtor, so the real estate that's his business. So he thought, ABC wants to talk about real estate. Fantastic. So he goes into the studio, does all that. And then out of that 1 or 1.5 hour interview, they picked out one or two things where one thing he says is, for instance, that, of course, the Trump organization has sold apartments to Russians. I mean, they've sold thousands of apartments. Obviously, there's going to be some Russian buyers among them. So then they picked out one or two of those little, sound bites. Then George Stephanopoulos aired those sound bites when the Clinton campaign needed them. And on the exact same day, within an hour or so, the Clinton campaign was pushing those sound bites in an ad on TV, on Twitter, and so on.
I really hope listening to you people understand the art of this deception. And the role that this is why I'm so critical of my colleagues as journalists, because what they have done discredits all of us. They have absolutely, by their own hand, destroyed the institution of the media and real journalism and what goes along with that. Because now we have a lot of voices out there, but very few of them have the backing to do firsthand investigative reporting anymore. It's expensive to do it properly. And because of people like this, who have gotten away with it, by the way, they've gotten away with it in the sense that they actually committed crimes, conspiring to influence the outcome of an election and to interfere with the election and to undermine a sitting president. These are actual crimes. And they've been allowed to get away with it and as a result continue the deception. That's why revoking the Pulitzer Prize matters, because until you do that, they get to continue the deception.
It would be, I completely agree with you. It would just be it's so important in their world. They put it on their CVs, they put it on their Twitter handles and so on. Pulitzer Prize. And I think Trump understands so well that this is something that's important to them. It's their world. It's something that they prize and they think is super, super important. Well, take that away from them. That hurts.
Well, what it also, they withhold that credibility from everybody else, right? So if you're Tucker Carlson, for example, it doesn't matter how many interviews you do or how much reporting you do that is recognized. It will never be recognized. That's the whole point. It doesn't matter how significant it is. It will never, ever be recognized. So you will never have the credibility that they give themselves, right, in the eyes of society. And people can say that, it doesn't mean anything. But you know what? Look at them when they put something forward. The New York Times publishes a story about Palantir, and everybody runs with it without questioning. Nobody goes to for example, I don't know, Palantir or to the government or whatever and says, can we explain this? Let's understand this better. They take it at face value and they cite the New York Times. So it doesn't matter how many times the New York Times lied about Russia. They lied about Trump. They lied about Christopher Steele. They lied about the dossier. They covered up for the Clinton campaign. And they did it over and over again. They ran a targeted assassination campaign against Carter Page, George Papadopoulos, Michael Flynn. I mean, the National Security Advisor of the United States. These publications went after everyone, and they did it in part as a message, to get compliance, right? To make sure that people wouldn't stand up. And they also send a message to their allies who were part of this conspiracy that if you're on our team, you're protected. You got nothing to worry about, right?
That's exactly right. And they even went after the sort of small fish like myself and some people I worked with in terms of, for instance, just to give you an example, when Steele wrote his dossier, of course, he had his sort of an insurance policy built in where he would, if he was ever asked, and eventually he was asked, where did you get this stuff from? He had this other guy whom he was paying, not much. It was just some Russian guy. They were saying, it was this Russian guy who told me, so he could always, wash his own hands.
Yes.
Now, that Russian guy, once the FBI figured out who that was, and this was in 2016, so very, very early, they knew the whole thing was a total scam because the Russian guy was an intern with the Brookings Institution in D.C. He knew nothing about Putin or any of those things. So it was all made up. So
and that
FBI,
was, can you say who?
Yeah, a guy called Igor Danchenko.
Danchenko, right? Yes.
So the FBI, we haven't talked about them yet, but they hid him. They literally hid him away. They gave him a status which is called confidential human source, which allowed them to just ghost him. They completely hid the guy. He didn't exist. They paid him money, but he didn't exist. So even if Chuck Grassley or any of the senators or Kash Patel or anyone came calling and said, hey, can we have some info on this or that? They could say, no, don't have anything. That no such person exists. And it was our group, so like 4 or 5 of us, who after painstaking work, years and years, figured out who that person is. We found him, even though the FBI had hid him. We found him, we named him, and it all panned out. And of course, as soon as we found him, we knew then what the FBI knew in 2016, which is that this guy is completely incredible. He's an intern with the Brookings Institution, which of course is also Democrat aligned. He's a good friend of Fiona Hill, who was one of the anti-Trump impeachment people back in 2019, 2020. So we could talk a lot about this guy. The point is, we found him. Did we get a Pulitzer? No, what we got is we got a smear story against us in the New York Times.
Of course. What did the New York Times try to say about you that wasn't true?
Well, they said that Trump fans unearthed the super secret FBI source and kind of jeopardized everything.
Jeopardized what? The investigation?
Well, this guy's life or this guy's security or whatever, and just kind of the investigation and his use to the FBI, as a super secret source. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the FBI were trying so hard to get to the truth. So, you have to wonder if some of those documents are what was hidden behind the wall inside the FBI that FBI Director Kash Patel says that they found, right? You got to wonder what else they were hiding inside that wall. But, one of the things that you remind me of when you lay this out is just how heavily involved so many people were. Because you had, for example, John Brennan, right? He wrote that report on Russia collusion. And then he attaches at the bottom the Steele dossier because he can't include it as part of the intelligence because it's so obviously fake. So he attaches this and he gives it to Congress. That's how he makes sure it reaches every member of Congress. Let's not forget that it was John McCain, right, who actually physically hand-carried the Steele dossier over to the FBI. Officially. That was the cover story. Of course, they probably already had it. But look at that. What is the significance of the fact that it was a Republican who took this dossier and officially put it in the hands of the FBI, therefore providing the justification for the FBI to take this seriously?
Right now, somewhere in Nigeria, there's a Christian family being persecuted. Those who are not killed are often forced to flee their homes, just because they believe in our Savior, Jesus Christ. At Equipping the Persecuted, They're committed to reaching every affected area to find these people and help heal the deep physical and emotional wounds that have been inflicted upon them. But they can't help them without your support. So please visit equippingthepersecuted.org and donate today. Sign up for just $35 a month. It's a little over $1 a day, and you'll help rescue Christians who are suffering and provide security, medical care, food, shelter, and love. The situation is urgent, so I'm asking you to join in the next 10 minutes. And if you do, they'll send you a special thank you gift. If you're wondering if your support will make a difference, I can tell you that it will. And if you've ever thought about helping, this is the time. It's a life of fear and danger for these Christians, but for just over $1 a day, you can change everything. It could be the most important thing you do today. Go online to equippingthepersecuted.org and make a difference in the life of a persecuted Christian. That's www.equippingthepersecuted.org.
Yeah, exactly right. And, you mentioned Brennan. You asked earlier what's one of the big things people don't know. And I led with the media angle because, as I explained, it's just something that is particularly kind of grating because they're the ones who are supposed to tell us the truth. But Brennan is pretty high on that list, too, of things people don't know. Back in July of 2016, so before any of this kicked off, before Trump had been accused of Russia collusion, before Mueller, before all these things, Brennan's CIA, he was CIA director at the time, they intercepted a communication involving a Clinton campaign foreign policy advisor, whom I think is Jake Sullivan, but I can't prove it. And there weren't many to choose from, and so Sullivan is obviously high on that list. So that on that call, Sullivan talked about Clinton's plot to smear Trump with Russia collusion. In other words, the entire scheme, the Clinton campaign scheme to do exactly what they did with the Russia collusion was already known to John Brennan in July of 2016. And instead of, at least publishing it or doing something with it or going after the Clinton campaign for, pushing such a dangerous hoax, which had huge national security implications, by the way, what did he do? He doubled down to cover it up and to push it himself. So he's like, oh, the Clinton campaign's doing this great. I'm going to jump on board here and pour some gas on the fire and make this even worse. And by the way, Obama was on board with that as well. So again, the idea...
Or they were already involved, Hans.
Yeah, they were, but...
Or they were already part of it. So they're not jumping on board. I mean, because let's not forget, you can't prove that it was Jake Sullivan, but John Brennan can. As head of the CIA at the time, he knew exactly who was having that conversation.
No, you're absolutely right. Of course, it's entirely possible they were on board much earlier. But in terms of just the things we can prove, we can definitively prove, we can absolutely 100% prove that both John Brennan and Barack Obama knew that this whole thing was a Clinton campaign hoax in July of 2016.
Okay. Boy, there's few things that get my blood boiling as much as this. And I tell you why. It's partly personal, right? Because as a journalist, when I read the Steele Dossier, it was very obvious to me. It was very obvious to me from the first moment that it was nonsense. And I just want to ask you, as someone else who's read the Steele Dossier, what did you think when you read it?
I remember it exactly. It was January 10th, 2017. This was before Trump was even inaugurated for his first term. And it was just such laughable rubbish. I mean, on page one, it starts off with, Trump has been recruited and been doing this for many years and so on. He was a celebrity TV host. He had nothing to do with Russia, or it is absolutely ridiculous. Then it talked about how much he hated Michelle Obama and all this kind of just this really crappy like stuff that a kid might have written. And it was so obviously fake that I just laughed it off. And I was like, oh, by the way, that was Jake Tapper, January 10th, 2017. That was him. He was the guy who kind of shot the starting gun on this one. And then, of course, everyone was off to the races.
And then
every
BuzzFeed,
day after that,
right?
It was nonstop. But
BuzzFeed played a big role in it because there were a bunch of them who had been given the dossier and they were competing.
Absolutely. But I completely agree with you that anyone with just half of a functioning brain, or even less, who read this thing would have immediately known that it's all completely fake and made up. Just even if we just ignore the stories themselves, the way they were presented, just the way the thing looked, everything looked so cheesy and cheap and fake, and it was just so obvious. And again, you asked me what was my reaction. I just laughed it off, and I thought, well, this is going to be like a 2-day story, and then we're all going to move on because this is so obviously fake. And how wrong I was.
Well, it's interesting because as a journalist, I was looking to what were the sources, and there was no firsthand eyewitness account. There were no firsthand sources. There were no secondhand sources. It was all hearsay. They couldn't even, they didn't even have enough to create a fake firsthand account. They didn't even have someone willing to say, I witnessed this. They could only say, I heard this from so-and-so. And then so-and-so told me, and then so-and-so told somebody else, and then somebody else told, Christopher Steele. As it turns out, Igor Danchenko told Christopher Steele. But so when I read this, I was just extremely disappointed to see that it was being, even though people put unverified on it, they were treating it as if it was gospel, right? And the moment I spoke up, this was really interesting for me because I had never really paid much attention to Donald Trump up until that point. I actually thought during the campaign, I think I was a little bit influenced by much of the information operation against him. I just didn't take him seriously. I thought this guy was, running for his own reasons, his own gain, and he just wasn't a serious candidate. And then, of course, the Steele Dossier happened, and I was like, wait a minute. Like, this is obviously a setup. This is obviously profoundly dishonest. And then as I watched this unfold, I became more and more frustrated, not because I was a fan of Donald Trump, but because the dishonesty, the deception, the conspiracy that was involved was very easy to see if you had an open mind. You didn't have to be a Trump fan. It had nothing to do with Donald Trump in many ways. What I saw was one side of a losing political campaign had a well-targeted operation that was being propped up by the media. And I just want you to talk about the implications of that. What does that mean for this country?
The implications are horrible. And they're only, the whole thing is only lessened or kind of made a bit better, I guess, because Trump got reelected. If Trump had not been reelected, all those implications we would be stuck with, and they would just get worse and worse. So that's sort of my light to kind of, I guess I'm starting at the end here. That's my light at the end of the tunnel, that people did see through it, or enough people saw through it to reelect Donald Trump, which of course, was just amazing on so many levels. But what it means in terms of the bigger picture is, like, let's go back to 10 years from, now, when Donald Trump came down that escalator. And I had been following him for a very, very long time. I was very excited. I thought it was fantastic. And I was very hopeful.
Well,
and all those
your
things.
mother was friends with Ivana Trump, right?
Yeah, she was. So the Ivana was always, like, when I was growing up, there was kind of a running joke at home that she went to marry the larger-than-life billionaire, and my mom, she ended up with my dad. So this was so Donald Trump,
a family joke.
That name would have been around when I was 2, 3, 4 years old. And so it was always there. And of course, I kind of kept abreast of what he was up to, and I read his books. And I don't know. I wouldn't describe myself as a fan of anyone, because everyone has their flaws. I'm not kind of into that kind of thing. But certainly a larger than life person and an amazing person, someone whose will, he kind of imagines stuff and then kind of makes it happen. It's very fascinating to watch. So back in 2015, I thought, wow, this is great. Finally, it's happening. But I think what the hoax did to myself and many, many millions of others, I think, is it opened our eyes to how badly corrupted the institutions really are. Of course, I've always hated the media. I mean, as long as I can remember. Of course, I always knew they lie about everything and so on and so forth. But I had no idea.
Not all of us, Hans. Not all of us.
I had no idea how bad it was. What we talked here a few moments ago in terms of them actually colluding with the Clinton campaign, them actually setting up people,
Yeah,
all the stuff we talked about.
outrageous.
If you'd told me that back in 2015, I probably wouldn't have believed that. Or the fact that the entire FBI upper echelons is completely corrupt. They know
Yes.
the whole thing is a hoax. By the way, we talked about Igor Danchenko. They called him in January of 2017 and said, hey, what do you know about this dossier? You're the source, supposedly. And he said, well, I don't know about anything. This is just gossip from my friends in Russia. My childhood friends,
That's
we just
right.
drank beers and, we just gossiped. That's what he told them was
That's
the
right.
dossier.
Yep, I remember. And he had to admit that, when he was interviewed, he had to admit that. He confirmed that. That's among the documents that have been released. I mean, this is not in dispute.
Yeah, but even that is not true because he didn't come up with the stories. I mean, the Clinton
No.
campaign had sort of parameter what the stories should be. You should have a story that Trump colluded this way, that way. This is all kind of
Yes.
preset. So he was guided in what he should say, or Steele was guided in what he should say. And this Danchenko guy, he was just a fall guy. He was just like, well, we'll just blame it on him. So when as you say, when the FBI came and when he was forced to say what it was, he couldn't even get himself to say, well, no, I just signed off on it. He blamed it on his friends back home in Russia, not even in Moscow, in a
That's
town.
right.
In a town called Perm, which is like 1,000 miles east of Moscow. So, far away from anything. And some random guy in Perm supposedly knows Putin's innermost secrets, which he spilled over beer with Igor Danchenko.
Yeah, and also knows exactly what happened inside hotel rooms, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, come on. It's just ridiculous. And that Trump specific, I remember one of the more salacious sort of things of the dossier was that Trump had specifically requested to stay in a room that Obama had stayed in, right? And he had 2 prostitutes stand over him and pee on him. And, it was so ridiculous. They couldn't even bring themselves to reprint the nonsense, but it allowed them. They gave themselves the ability to treat all of it as if it were true and to use it against him and to use it very effectively against him because they had total information dominance. Right? And
Exactly.
if you spoke up, if you questioned it in any way or pointed out any of this, like I was attacked and immediately targeted and smeared as being far right, the far right Trump supporter, right? When it had nothing to do with that. I was trying to say, hey, that what they're saying is not true. Like whoever it benefits, whoever it discredits. But the reality is our job as journalists is to find the truth. And it wasn't that hard to find. And now what you explain in your book, Swiftboating America, is that journalists knew about it long ahead of time.
There was even the whole hotel room, he wanted to be in Obama's hotel room and all that big lie. There's even more to that story. It's even worse. And the media knew this as well, because there was something called I called it the proto-dossier, but it's sort of a pre-dossier, so a pre-Christopher Steele dossier,
Yes.
written by the Steele campaign, by Clinton campaign, by one of their operatives, a guy called Cody Shearer, ahead of time. So before Steele did his thing. And the exact same story happens in that dossier as well, only that it's not at the Ritz-Carlton on, near Red Square in Moscow. It's sort of in a suburb of Moscow, about an hour away. But the story is exactly the same. So again, I like things that I can actually prove, where I don't have to rely on what someone said. I don't have to rely on anything like that. I can just prove it. And this is absolute proof, where you have one story coming out of the Clinton campaign matches very closely another story coming out of the Clinton campaign. So obviously this is a concocted story, but they changed some of the details. Obviously they placed it all in the Ritz-Carlton to make it sound more, important, and to bring, as you mentioned, Obama into the fray because he had stayed there and so on. So to kind of add on to that story.
And to make it more believable, because people could believe that Trump hated Obama, right? That seemed like, it would resonate with Americans. If you made it completely random, then it was just a nasty sexual story. But if you tied it to Obama, now it became, a salacious political gossip, right? And something
Exactly.
that people would be more inclined to believe if they shared that sentiment. So if they hated Obama, then they could identify with that. Or if they thought, oh yeah, if they loved Obama, it was, oh yeah, Trump just wants to get Obama. And it appealed to the lowest common denominator, really. It appealed to everything that is nasty. I think one of the things I hated about it from the beginning is that I didn't grow up on the playground, or in a world where playground gossip was elevated or revered. In my house, you got smacked right down if you brought that to the table. I wasn't raised that way. And this smacked of nasty, dirty, made-up nonsense gossip.
Why are so many young people struggling to have babies today? Birth rates in the US are at record lows, and that's partly because testosterone levels are dropping all the time. According to some studies, T levels are roughly half of what they were 50 years ago. And if we don't reverse this trend, we could be looking at population collapse. And it's why we partnered with CHOQ. They're a Patriot-owned supplement company, and their mission is to save mankind from extinction. They have something called the Male Vitality Stack, and it's been shown in clinical trials to boost your free testosterone by 87% in just 21 days. That is not just a statistic. You will feel it. And ladies, you'll be pleased to know it's not just for men. The Female Vitality Stack addresses just about every complaint a woman can have: stress, mood, hormones, energy, and focus. And it'll even help you keep up with your man. So go to CHOQ.com and use code LARA for 17.76% off your subscription. Cancel anytime. Or you can also call 50-CHOQ 3000 and tell them Lara sent you.
And the media knew this. Again, so this first dossier didn't go to everyone. It went to some select members of the media.
To who, do you know?
Some of their friends. But again, at least those people knew. And again, not speculating, not whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that this is all made up because the same story appears in two different
places,
variations out of both out of the Clinton campaign over the course of a couple of months. So at that point, you if you are an honest person, never mind a journalist or anything, just as an honest person, you have to say, come on.
Okay, Hans, who's behind this? Who was the mastermind of this? Was there a mastermind?
That is such a great question, and I don't know. So first of all, I don't know. I like to deal with things that I do know as a starting point, and then kind of take it from there. The first documented proof that we have of the Clinton campaign hoax or the Russiagate hoax or whatever you want to call it is in February of 2016. There's some internal emails which came out through the John Podesta email leak later on, which weren't noticed at the time. The email leak was in October of 2016, shortly before the election. People probably remember that whole thing through WikiLeaks. But at the time, I don't think it was noticed much. But, sorting through it over time and so on, you could find some emails in February of 2016 where the Clinton campaign, so Jennifer Palmieri, who was communications chief, and various others, Podesta and so on, talk about this smear campaign against Trump, which, by the way, they called the Swiftboat project or Swiftboat campaign, hence the name of my book. So is it possible that they were given the idea to do this by John Brennan or Obama? Or yeah, of course, it's entirely possible. Or that there was some kind of coordination going on between government actors and the Clinton campaign as far back as February of 2016 or even earlier. That's entirely possible. But we can't prove that. In terms of what we can prove, it started with the Clinton campaign in February of 2016. And then we can prove certain things along the way where they hired Christopher Steele and they instructed various members of the media like ABC we talked about to do this or that. And then we get to July of 2016 where we have the first documented proof of Obama's involvement. Again,
Which is
it's
what?
entirely possible he was involved much earlier.
What's the documented proof of his involvement?
So I think it's one of those things. I kind of often compare it to the COVID cover-up. There wasn't one mastermind. I mean, a lot of people had an interest in pulling this in the same direction, namely to damage Trump, to sabotage Trump. So a lot of people thought it was a great idea for their own reasons. And then, or, maybe a better analogy is the ant colony, where the individual ant doesn't really know what they're doing, but together they're doing it, building things together or transporting things together or whatever. And in this case, everyone, that means the Clinton campaign, the Clinton operatives, the media, the institutions, the government, and institutions goes very wide. I mean, sort of Hollywood, obviously, but I would also include, we haven't talked about the Alpha Bank hoax. Maybe we'll talk about that, because the IT sector, literally the US IT sector, also got involved in this. So a lot of parts, moving parts that people don't even know about. But what I'm trying to say is we're talking about at least 20, 30 different groups, interest groups, people who all thought this was a great idea to advance this Russia collusion hoax.
That's quite incredible, isn't it? When you look at it like that. I mean, you had the media involved, you had a political campaign, you had people in the intelligence community, in the CIA, but not confined to the CIA, right? Because the NSA knew about those intercepted calls. The DNI's office had access to those calls. I mean, broadly speaking, there's a whole swath of people across the intelligence community that had access and knew about this. And then you go to law enforcement and the FBI, which obviously was in it up to its neck. You have legal firms like Mark Elias's legal firm that's involved, and then of course you have people in the think tanks, right? Like the Brookings Institute, which is just one of the they're at the forefront of the globalist war to destroy this country. And Brookings has been heavily involved in this and more Marxist and overtly Marxist for a long time. And so you have academia involved. You have the nonprofit sector involved. It's just what's incredible to me is, were they all involved as far back as February of 2016? Or did that sort of emerge over time?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a cascading effect where the thing grows, the hoax grows bigger and bigger, and more people kind of get involved. But, you're absolutely right. What's so fascinating is that none of these people, none of these groups, none of these institutions at any point put a stop to it, where, when it grows and grows, you would have thought, well, someone's going to blow the whistle here, and that didn't happen.
Yes.
I mentioned IT earlier. I think this is a
critical point.
This is not only an underreported story. I think it's a completely unreported story. I mean, I talk about it in my book, but I've never seen it being reported anywhere else. I don't want to digress too much in terms of all the things that the Clinton campaign did, or what the FBI did, or what they all did. But just in a nutshell, one of the things they wanted to do, one of the smears, was that Trump had a secret communications channel with Putin. So Trump was talking to Putin. And so there was this server in Trump Tower, right, and there was a server in Moscow, and they were talking. That's the smear. That's the hoax.
I'm sorry, but it's just so ironic when you consider that Hillary Clinton is the one who had a private server when she was Secretary of State, and she was the one who was breaking the law and communicating privately with people. It's incredible, because time and time again, they take what they're doing and they project that. It's a tactic in information warfare called projection. They project that onto their adversaries. And there's a plethora of examples like this. And it's amazing to hear it. So here you go again. How do they know that they can create a smear like that? Because they're guilty of doing it themselves. So they create this smear that Trump has this secret server and he's secretly communicating with Putin. Okay, carry on.
It's just beyond ridiculous, but it kind of gets worse in terms of the implications, in terms of who knew and how wide that went, and no one blew the whistle. So on that particular story, as ridiculous as it is, they got one of their favored journalists to run that story, a guy called Franklin Foer. He ran a whole bunch of stories for them in Slate magazine. So he ran that story
Slate,
for them.
which is another left-wing propaganda site. I mean,
correct.
That's
and
not
he
even
ran that
vaguely
story
journalism.
for them. The story that alleges that Trump had a secret communications channel with Putin. And then the allegation was that there were these pings on the DNS system and the internet, and that's how they know this. It was completely transparently just false.
Is such ridiculous.
And it's not even my wheelhouse, this whole IT sector, but even I know enough to have just looked at that and this is absolutely totally ridiculous. But the Slate guy, this is a wonderful story. The guy from Slate, Franklin Foer, got one of the top internet people, one of the inventors of various parts of the internet, or at least one parts of the technology, a guy called Paul Vixie, to in his article to basically confirm this. It's just unheard of that you have someone so high up who knows the stuff inside out and invented part of it, saying that it's true when it's obviously not. Now, here's the funny part. There's a sort of a private chat group within that community of very, very high-ranking IT executives called Crimeware. That's what they call their group. And immediately when that article came out, people on that Crimeware were ridiculing the story as well as Paul Vixie for standing up for a totally fake story. They were making fun of him in that secret group. And there are various, I'm not going to name them here, but there are various IT executives, people who run IT for major American organizations and so on. They're on that group. I mean, that information is available. I mean, Kash Patel has access. Many people have access to that group and what they were saying to each other. But the interesting part to me is not one of these people, these are just not even ordinary Americans. These are very high-ranking, rich, powerful, successful Americans.
People whose voices matter.
Not one single one of them came out in public and said what they were saying on that chat board, where they were totally ridiculing the story as well as Vixie. And Vixie, he in his, kind of to be fair, he came out and said, I shouldn't have done that interview. That was his excuse. Sort of, he was obviously entirely political. He basically.
Why do we have to be fair? That's the thing, Hans. Why do we have to be fair? This was a massive treasonous conspiracy that falls under treason and sedition under U.S. law. It was a revolution. It was designed to invalidate an election and install, right, and remove from power the legally elected president, the choice of the people. It cost millions and millions and millions of dollars that was spent on fake investigations. We haven't even touched on the Mueller investigation, which was just a cover-up. And they destroyed people. They destroyed Carter Page. They tried to destroy George Papadopoulos. They tried to destroy Michael Flynn and put his family through unknown hell. And they have continued to damage this country. I mean, to cause it untold harm. And, it's one thing if you want a fair fight, okay? I mean, if you're an avowed Marxist and you want to have, you want to run as a Marxist and you want to own the murder of millions of people under Lenin and Stalin and Mao Zedong and so on. If you want to own all that and say that you believe in it and you want to fight for that on its merits, fine. That's what our political system is designed for, right? You have the ability to do that. But what we're talking about here is we are talking about taking the institutions of our government that have made this country safe, that have supposedly have kept this country, have been the pillars of what it is that's keeping us going, by trusting in our law enforcement, by believing that our intelligence agencies, they may get things wrong, they may lie from time to time, but they're not actually going to be part of a revolution to overthrow the government of the United States of America, to undermine the will of the people to the point where it no longer matters, where none of it actually exists. I mean, that's what we are really talking about here. We are talking about globalist factions who don't believe in borders, who don't believe in any of the principles that they claim to represent. None of them. They don't believe that the people should have the right to choose. They believe that the people are unworthy. They look down on the people. When Hillary Clinton made her 2016 deplorable speech, that's what they really think. They think that the vast majority of people out there, the great unwashed, the masses, are absolutely worthless. They're incapable of making good decisions. They should have no right to vote, and they should have no right to actually participate in the political process whatsoever. That's what they believe. And the United States is a political system that is founded both on a covenant with God, but on the fundamental belief that all men are created equal and have the right to choose their own representatives, that those representatives serve the people and not the other way around. And none of these people actually believe that. They go out there and they say it and they campaign on it and they shove it down your throat, but not one single one of them believes that the people of the United States are qualified to choose their own leaders?
No, they don't. And unfortunately, we kind of the problem continues. The people who do these things are still in positions of power. For lack of a better word, I'm not a huge fan of this word, but the deep state. It not only exists, it is alive and well even now. I mean, just to illustrate, there is people wouldn't believe this, but there is still a Russia collusion case, a totally fake case going on right now as we speak. Despite Pam Bondi supposedly being the Attorney General and all of her team and so on supposedly being in charge, I ask myself, are they really in charge? The case that's still going on it's horrendous what they did to General Flynn. You've always talked about it. I've talked about it many times and so on. But they did something to a client of General Flynn to get General Flynn, a guy called Ekim Alptekin, a Dutch national. So what they did is they went after him to try and make him say bad stuff about Flynn, and then they would have used that to go after to tell Flynn to say bad stuff about Trump. The way they usually do it. The only reason this guy was targeted was because he was a client of General Flynn's firm back before 2016, when General Flynn had his consultancy firm. Anyway, long story short is that case against this guy is still going on as we speak right now. And to make matters worse, while Biden was in charge, while Biden was president, Joe Biden's brother, a guy called Jim Biden, flew out to Europe to meet this guy, the guy whose case is still ongoing, to offer him to make the case go away in exchange for a $2-3 million payment.
Wow. And he said no.
He said no. But his case is still going on right now. He's still in legal limbo.
What is he charged with?
He's charged with the stupid foreign agent thing.
The FARA, was it a violation of the FARA registration?
When he hired General Flynn, supposedly he should have registered as a foreign agent. This is the usual stuff, which, by the way, they never... First of all, it's not true. But second of all, they never charged it. That is one they kind of got out of the drawer when Trump came around, and then they started throwing it around.
Yes, it's so frustrating. And I hear you, Hans, and I think it's a very fair question is why is a case like this still going on? The Justice Department should have just dropped it immediately because it's an illegitimate prosecution that, by the way, is linked to something completely illegitimate. It reminds me of the fruit of the poisonous tree issues that many of the J6s faced, right? Where what they did was for example, with Jeremy Brown, the government planted a grenade and other fake evidence in Jeremy's trailer so that when his house was searched, by the way, a search warrant for 2 low-grade misdemeanor offenses, by the way, non-violent misdemeanor offenses, they incredibly found a grenade that they claimed a former Special Forces weapons sergeant had just left lying around. And that, this was now the excuse because he's convicted on the weapons charges before he was convicted on January 6 charges. So they were like, oh, well, this isn't covered by the pardon. It's that kind of thing when they can argue that we have a FARA violation that exists independently of the fact that the whole Russia collusion thing, the whole case against General Flynn was entirely fabricated just to remove him as national security advisor and remove him from Trump's orbit, right? Because the reason they hated General Flynn so much, I mean, there are multiple reasons, but, chief among them was the fact that Trump trusted him and respected him and spent, more than a year, by the way, trying to get him to join his campaign. And Flynn wasn't interested because he didn't know if Trump was serious or not. And he wasn't going to give up everything that he'd built all of his life to help someone who wasn't serious about reforming the country, and so they had to remove him. Plus, Flynn was never going to buy the Russia collusion nonsense. Flynn was going to be the guy in the White House that said, wait, what? Wait a minute. Hold on a second, right? He could have shot holes in all of it. So they couldn't brief Trump on any of this and keep this lie going with Flynn around. Plus, he was never going to be bought. They were never going to be able to buy Michael Flynn. So they had to create a case against him and others, by the way, like this guy. And it's an outrage that they haven't done anything about it. I'm always conscious of what I don't know, that, what else is going on. There's a short period of grace that those in power get because they're dealing with such a vast conspiracy that is still ongoing. and it's hard to see how anyone's going to deal with that.
Yeah,
Under the normal rules.
In this case, we're talking about a Mueller case. This is an actual Robert Mueller case. So that's the first thing that just goes out. You just end it, terminate it. January 20th, this year, and they didn't do that. So what it tells me, I sort of partly blame, Trump appointees, but on the whole, as you say, there's a lot of stuff going on. But what it really tells me is who's really still in charge, who are all, you see it, by the way, in NIH as well. Poor Jay Bhattacharya has so much trouble over there just getting very simple things done because all these people, these appointees, are surrounded by snakes and people who work against them.
And subverting them. Yeah. And Jay, by the way, is a lovely man and a very, very smart man, principled and committed. I mean, he's not just going to fold.
No, he's fantastic. But that to me is sort of the takeaway that you might be nominally in charge, but there's other people who still pull the strings. And, one of the things about Flynn, which very few people know, is such a sad part of that whole story. It has to do with Mike Pence. I mean, people won't be surprised when they hear what I'm about to say.
I might know
it. When Flynn was falsely accused, by DOJ, by Sally Yates, by these awful people back in early 2017, as you say, that there was a plot to get rid of him. So he was accused of having lied about, having talked about sanctions. This is very important. That was the accusation.
Yes, speak to the Russian ambassador about the sanctions that the Obama administration had put in place before leaving office.
And Flynn always maintained, no, I didn't talk about sanctions. It didn't happen. He just absolutely maintained it. So Trump, to his credit, very busy man. This was the first few weeks of his first term. He tasked his vice president, Mike Pence, with reviewing the transcript of Flynn's call with the Russian ambassador. He said, Mike, you go and tell me what really happened. And then Mike went into one of the rooms in the White House and they got the FBI to bring over the transcript, and it was the actual transcript, and he went through it. And the word sanctions is not mentioned in it. And yet, I have no explanation of why he did that. Mike Pence then said, Flynn lied, he's got to be fired. So it was Mike Pence's fault. People blame Trump for firing Flynn too quickly, but Trump did build in that safeguard where he had Pence double check that really happened. And Mike Pence said that really happened.
So, Hans, what this is in part connected to is that Trump almost chose Mike Flynn as his vice president in 2017, over Mike Pence.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a big deal for Pence. And Pence's campaign, they had launched a campaign against Michael Flynn long before they even took office, any of them. And, it really raises questions about Mike Pence because he seems to have a lot more in common in a way with, Obama and the left than he did with Trump in many ways. Because look at Pence, over the January 6th issue, the 2020 election issue, and look at Pence over Michael Flynn. And, people, they talk a good talk, but when you look at their actions over time, they start to look very different, right? And there's still very big question marks over Pence himself and where he really stands.
Oh, I mean, I think he completely exposed himself on January 6th because he was the one who riled up the crowd. I mean, he was out there a day or two earlier saying, we're going to have our day in Congress. We're going to hear the evidence. I know the words exactly because I've seen the clip so many times. And the people are yay and getting all excited about it. And then the next day he goes, no, we're not going to do any of these things. They
were denied all of that.
He caused that. And yet the media, celebrates him as some kind of hero. But again, this whole Flynn thing was 4 years before that, and it's essentially the same thing, unless he can't read. I mean, maybe he pretended to read the transcript, but didn't read the transcript, or whatever. But demonstrably, Flynn doesn't talk about sanctions in there. I mean, I've read it. We can all take a look. It didn't happen, and Pence goes, "Oh yeah, no, Flynn lied."
It's interesting because the transcript, is not locked away in some vault. They could have read it. They had access to it anytime they wanted. Just this idea that the FBI has to bring it over and you have to go into a special room. I mean, all of this is posturing and nonsense. You know what? These are all indications that they're involved in the cover-up and in the conspiracy. That's all that is. It doesn't have to be that way at all. And the only frustration for me is that the president has extraordinary powers in all of this. As the commander-in-chief and as the president himself, I mean, he's the only person who the act of speaking is an act of declassification. So, all of this can be declassified. And it would be certainly gratifying for a lot of people, for the whole truth to come out. But part of the problem is, and this is why I really urge people to read your book, Swift-Boating America, is that it's so many years after the fact, and it's come out in so many little drips and drabs, and it is also it's a vast conspiracy. So people just don't want to apply themselves to figuring out what the truth really is.
That is so true. And as far as, Mike Pence is concerned, you make such a good point as well, where they said, no, you can only read it in a special room and we'll bring it over, but everything has to be secret and so on and so forth.
Give me a break.
Even though the president has the authority just to declassify or read it himself or whatever. But I think that brings up another point. What gave them, and by them, I mean James Comey, Andrew McCabe, FBI leadership, what gave them the confidence right at the start of Trump's first term, that they can show Mike Pence the transcript where Flynn does not lie and still have Pence go and tell Trump that Flynn lied? What gave them that?
Question.
How were they so sure that was going to happen? How did they know that Pence wasn't going to say, hey, he never talked about sanctions. What are you guys talking about? How did they know that wasn't going to happen?
Well, how did they? Do you know the answer?
Well, I don't, but as I said, he's either incapable of reading and they knew that, or he was in cahoots with them.
Okay, Hans, so this is like super frustrating, right? Because if you care about the truth, and obviously the consequences here are very significant for every single person in this country. How many years do we have to keep going without getting the whole truth?
It is extremely frustrating. I come back to the poor Akim Alptekin, who is still in legal limbo, because they can't even shut down a case which should have been shut down 4 years ago or 5 years ago, whatever it is. That's the thing, where what hope is there at getting some of these documents when they can't even do the most simple, obvious, straightforward things? And those are just the known unknowns. I mean, I can give you 10 or 20 or 30 documents. I can give you a big list of things I'd love to see where I know it exists, but it's been hidden away. But, you mentioned earlier the FBI's kind of black hole where they just hid things which we don't even know exist. So these are these unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld used to call them. We have no idea what else there is. And what are the chances of seeing that? I mean, probably pretty much zero.
Well, I wouldn't say zero. I mean, yet, right? Maybe a year from now, I would agree with you, zero. But I would say we still have a window, right? Because we don't know what else they're dealing with, what else they're working on, and how these pieces fit. That's my only hesitation, because I join you and millions of other people in being frustrated at the lack of accountability, being sort of, somewhat disillusioned by the slow pace of what is going on. Because it's not like, we're talking about something that happened how many years ago now? It was a long time ago. Don't tell me that you came into office and you had to start from the beginning, that that this is somehow a new investigation. And by the way, don't tell me that you have 4 years to get your investigation done, or 3 or 2. It's that, that's not going to work either. And this idea that, well, we have to do things properly because other people didn't do things properly doesn't give us the right to do so. No, nobody's suggesting you don't do things properly. But what people are pointing out is that you have a narrow window. You don't have forever to get this done. And as long as you allow these people to get away with their crimes, they continue to commit the same crimes and new ones.
Well, that is so true. No one has been held to account for any of this stuff. I mean, there's this one FBI lawyer who got a slap on the wrist.
Kevin Clinesmith.
That's correct. But yeah, I don't even count that. First of all, he was this kind of a small fish in the whole scheme of things, which is always the way they do it. But no one has been held to account. That is such a damning...
Can I challenge you there a little bit? The narrative is that he was a small fish. And I understand what you're saying. He doesn't have the same role, as, for example, Christopher Steele. But at the same time, this is the lawyer. This is a lawyer inside the FBI who went to the FISA court which is the top surveillance court in the land, and presented falsified documents in order to justify the surveillance that was basically the foundation of much of the smear, and targeted people like Carter Page. And what he was specifically caught for was the fact that the FBI put this request in to the CIA that said, do you know Carter Page? Is he working for you? And they specifically worded it, right, where they could get away with saying he didn't work for them at that moment, but that he had worked and been working for the CIA at the time of the events that were covered by the FISA warrants, right? And by the subject of the investigation. So the CIA was playing their own disingenuous game because they were forced to admit, because they couldn't deny it, because there's proof that Carter Page was on their books. But then they tried to have it both ways by saying, but he's not on our books now, as if that mattered. It was completely irrelevant because it was outside the time frame of the investigation. But what they did was that Clinesmith removed that. So basically, he falsified the evidence. He knew perfectly well that if he told the FISA court that Carter Page was confirmed by the CIA to have been working for them at the time that was under investigation, that it would have nullified the entire thing and they couldn't have given a FISA warrant. So, in many ways, that is a massive, massive issue that kind of gets undermined by saying he was a small fish, which I know is not your intent, right?
Well, no, it's not my intent, but if you look, there's different ways of looking at it. So if we look at the organizational chart of the FBI, I completely agree with you, but I think we're both kind of coming at it from different angles. If you look at the organizational chart, this guy, Kevin Clinesmith, was like 5, 6, 7 rungs down. He was way, way down. Even within the legal department of the FBI, he was way down. But your point is so good, because what is going on in this guy's mind? Why would he do that, which he knows is a massive crime, what he's doing at that moment, unless he knows he's got cover, or unless someone told him to do that, or at a minimum, unless the entire structure at the FBI, the sort of the leadership structure and the work environment is so completely toxic that he knows he can do anything because no one would dare blow the whistle or come after him, because everyone wants to go after Trump. So at a minimum, there was an understanding among all these people, whether low, high, or whatever, that they can do this because we're all going to try and to take down Trump here. And I think that's the takeaway. That's the horrible part of it. So in that sense, he's not a small fish at all. I mean, in that sense, he's part of this horrific edifice that they built there. But at the same time, just in terms of, I think the reason I think we really agree here is because someone who is nominally so low would do something so bad. And I don't think he would just do that of his own volition. No. And of course, the crime itself is not small, because that's what the media tried to say. Oh, this guy's a low-level attorney. Right. Therefore, what he did is not important, right? It's not a big deal. But it was a very big deal. And that's the issue here, because it completely obliterated the Fourth Amendment. It rendered the FISA court, totally corrupt, right? I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, who believes the FISA court now? What credibility do they have left after doing that? Those judges should all be held accountable. Oh, it happened to be the exact same judge who then later on came back to, this is this guy called Boasberg, James Boasberg. So he gave Clinesmith a slap on the wrist, almost apologized to him for having to go through all this. Oh, poor guy. Poor little Clinesmith. Terrible. Yeah. And more recently, Boasberg came back when he anointed himself as the sort of final arbiter of immigration decisions and the whole Kilma Abrego issue, the Maryland dad, that was the Boasberg Maryland dad who was who's now been charged with trafficking human beings for 9 years as part of MS-13, which is now a terrorist organization. And you're so right how the entire institution of the courts has been undermined by these kinds of things. And that's not just what Clinesmith did, and not only that he got a slap on the wrist, not only that Boasberg happened to be the judge who did that, but also that Boasberg shows up again and again doing these horrible things. And in the Kilmar Abrego case, I don't think this is being widely reported. This happened on a weekend. So the petitioners for, against him being removed, I think it was ACLU, whoever, some group, some, NGO type who came in, you can't remove this guy. They came in on a weekend, which, the courts are closed. So you have a duty judge who's then called and can he come in and deal with this? And it was not Boasberg. But Boasberg, because he's the chief judge in DC, he got wind of it and he said, no, me, I'm going to come in.
Yeah. Raised his hand. Oh, because Boasberg now has a vested interest in protecting these people, right? Because if they go down, he goes down with them.
Yeah.
And I say again, this is the result of not holding people accountable. If he had been held accountable for what he did during the Russia conspiracy, he wouldn't be around to create this problem for the Trump administration now, or for the American people, for that matter,
but
who
Boasberg
voted in the millions for this immigration policy.
That's right. But Boasberg was also the chief judge of the FISA court, the one that got defrauded. So he's the chief judge of the FISA court that gets defrauded. He's also the guy who then judges on Clinesmith, the guy who did the defrauding, not as a chief judge of the FISA court, but as the chief judge of the normal court in DC. And then he's also the guy who scuppers and sabotages Trump and all these other things. All the same person. And that's the core of it. I mean, Washington, D.C. is completely incestuous. It's always the same characters, always the same names, always the same people. And they all know each other. And they all go to the same cocktail parties. And they all have their kids at the same schools.
So, Hans, let's go back to who do we know, who is confirmed on the Clinton side of this to have been involved from the very beginning, or as far back as we can tell?
Jake Sullivan is a big one on that. We speculated a bit earlier whether he is the one who carelessly talked on the phone while CIA was listening in about his plot against Trump or the Clinton campaign's plot. That we cannot confirm, but we can confirm that he was in charge of another aspect of this whole Russia collusion hoax, which was the Alpha Bank hoax. We talked about that earlier. That's the one where they alleged that Trump had the secret communications channel with Putin through Russia's Alpha Bank. They were the ones who were supplying, the infrastructure, supposedly, all made up.
So the idea is that Trump has these servers he has these private servers, and he's communicating with Alpha Bank, and they're communicating with Putin. So they're kind of like the middleman, right?
100%, exactly. And so that was Jake Sullivan's baby. He was in charge of that part of the project. So we know that for a fact.
How do you know that?
Because he sent out messages during the campaign, so during the 2016 campaign, pushing this Alpha Bank story. He put his name to it. He said, computer scientists have told us Trump has a secret communications channel and so on. So he was the one that literally put his name to all these false allegations.
He's such a little weasel. I know I shouldn't say that, strictly speaking, but I can't help it. He is such a little weasel. I think it's because of the role that he played in the Afghan disaster, and just knowing that there are still women in prisons in Afghanistan who are being raped, tortured, knowing how many people were murdered, how many lives were ruined. It's just disgusting to me that these people.
Now his wife is in Congress, so the same incestuousness again. They all have a foothold somewhere. And by the way, he's just waiting somewhere in the background.
In the wings to come back. And he's probably not even in the wings. You know what I mean? Where was he, during the Biden administration? How closely was he related to the, basically running the country in the absence of a real president, because he had dementia, which they all knew and covered up.
And also in the interim, when Trump was president in his first term, I mean, I think he was involved with that appointment that Biden had, that kind of fake university appointment or whatever. I mean, don't quote me on that, but they all have these kind of fake roles. Then they become advisor of this or some NGO or whatever. And then they just kind of wait around for 4 years. But as you say, it's not just waiting in the wings. They're probably still doing very bad things. Plus, they're getting paid a lot of money. So it's not like they have to kind of wait around and spend money. And then, 4 or 8 years later, whatever it is, they all come back, and it's always the same characters. And it's just this sort of merry-go-round. And I think that's what has to be broken up. If there's going to be any better future where this thing really changes. I mean, the past few months obviously have been a bit disappointing with, what happened with Doge not getting where they wanted to go, mainly because of the courts and, just sabotage everywhere and so on. I always say what you should do is break up Washington, D.C. Look at it like this monopoly and just break it up And the easiest way to break it up is by just physically breaking it up. So you just send all these departments and agencies and so on all around the country. So what you eliminate then is that they all know each other, that they all go to the same cocktail parties, that they all know each other's children and schools, and all that stuff is eliminated by just spreading it out everywhere.
Well, the Obama administration did that after Benghazi. They sent all those people over. They got them to sign NDAs, gave them awards, and then sent them all to different corners of the earth so that they couldn't be in one place.
Yep.
But I will say this to you, Hans. I think what you described is the old model in one sense. They don't sit around waiting for the next 4 years or the 8 years. That was the old model, right? Where you pretty much, whether it was George Bush Sr. or it was Bill Clinton or it was George Bush Jr., whoever it is, you pretty much had two sides of the same coin. We thought they were opposing parties. Actually, they were just more of the same. And there were some differences here and there, but really they were working for the same goals and for the same ideology. And so there was never just people were waiting around then to get back into the prime position. But now what they do is that they are actively involved in subversion and treason. They're no longer just waiting around. Like you have groups like Beacon Global Strategies, which was Hillary Clinton's cabinet in waiting, right? Which had Michelle Flournoy, who was designated by Hillary to be her Secretary of Defense had she won the election. Well, this woman had moved into the Pentagon before the election was even over. She had already moved her staff in there. These people aren't just waiting. They're actively still running the government from these boards. For example, the defense boards that were exposed where Pete Higgs sat then and fired people. They're actively still engaged in running the government. And on top of that, you have people like West Avenue Executive, right? Where they actually are organized and still running things. And I say this again, over and over and over again. These people are still operating because their crimes are exposed and they're never, ever held accountable.
And that is really the biggest problem among everything we've just discussed, the fact that no one has been held to account. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't hold people to account, it will just happen again and again. And there's no remedy I can suggest other than finally holding someone to account. And not just Russiagate, also the whole Ukraine impeachment hoax. That is like, as soon as Trump was declared innocent, or at least he was acquitted, it disappeared. And I remember this was just before COVID. And I remember this was February of 2020. And I'm like, no. Now you have to go after the people who made up all the stories, the Ciaramellas. And by the way, he was involved with tangentially with the Russia hoax as well. Again,
that's
totally
Eric
unexplored
Ciaramella,
topic.
who was the so-called whistleblower, right? Who was responsible.
Correct.
But okay, so let's talk about that for a moment, Hans, because you're exactly right. The problem is right after the impeachment, it's sort of, conservatives and Republicans said, "Oh, Hugh, we dodged that bullet," as if it was a bullet anyway, because it wasn't even real, should never have been allowed to proceed. But that's how they responded. And then before anyone could talk about accountability, COVID hit. How convenient, right?
Yeah.
And it was right before that, it was really looking like Trump was going to sail through the election, which, obviously was changed overnight with COVID. But if we look at that, I talked about them using projection as a strategy. Well, they had Biden on tape admitting that he did exactly what they accused Trump of doing. But they covered it up by saying, well, he was doing that as a member of the government kind of thing. You know what I mean? And he was doing it for the right reasons. Trump was doing it for the wrong reasons. But who was the person who was exposing that? That was John Solomon, who now has Just the News, right? They went after John Solomon with a force, right, to destroy him. And then Rudy Giuliani. Yeah. Rudy Giuliani was the one investigating it. And they didn't stop. Right. They kept going, because then Rudy Giuliani was part of the team that was investigating and exposing the fraud of the 2020 election. And so they just kept on going, boy. And they have gone after Rudy Giuliani, who is a great person. I know him personally, just like I know Michael Flynn personally. I've known Rudy for years, and he is a great American and a real hero. and he has been ridiculed, and he has been bankrupted, and he has been the subject of the most vindictive and vicious prosecution. That is a complete misuse of the justice system, a totally politically motivated prosecution. And it's outrageous that we allow these things to continue.
And some of it, in analogy to what we said earlier about some of these Mueller cases continuing, some of the fallout from this Ukraine impeachment hoax is still continuing as well. There was this guy at the Ukrainian embassy called Andrei Telizhenko, who at the time came forward and, might say that wasn't very wise of him because of, how corrupt everything is, but he's an honest guy. And he came forward and he talked to Senators Johnson and Grassley and said, look, I was there when the whole thing went down with Sierra Mella. I was there when this and that happened. So again, he knows all the stories. He told all the stories as an insider from within the Ukrainian side. And what did they do to shut him up? Trump's own appointees, Steve Mnuchin and Mike Pompeo, sanctioned the guy. And then the media said, oh, this whistleblower isn't really a whistleblower. He's a U.S. government sanctioned guy who lied. He's acting for Russia.
Yeah, they went for his credibility. They took his credibility away from him.
Exactly. But those sanctions are still in place to this day, right now.
Outrageous. And that brings me to another very important point, that this may have been the master sort of strategy of the Clinton campaign in its inception, but there were many significant players in this who were on the right, who were Republicans, some of them, like Pompeo and Mnuchin, in Trump's own circle.
Yeah. For the Russia impeachment hoax, absolutely. And there's another little kind of fact that most people probably don't know, but once you hear it, you can never unhear it. It's just so stark in terms of how all these things are connected. Do you know when the Ukraine impeachment started? It started the morning after the Russiagate hoax ended. The Russiagate hoax ended in July 25th of 2019, when Robert Mueller had his train wreck testimony in Congress, where he was just a senile old man and no collusion and can't remember and outside my purview, and just that whole train wreck. And Democrats just couldn't get any traction out of everything. And that was the day it was over. The impeachment hoax started, the Ukraine impeachment hoax with Sierra Mella and Vindman and all that started the very next morning.
It's really quite incredible. And you just mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, another horrible person, also a traitor and guilty of many crimes, who's been allowed to get away with it and not been held accountable. That one burns me too. Hans, I want to ask you something. You mentioned that we talked about Kevin Clinesmith being low down the chain in the FBI. Who are the people? What's the structure of the people within the FBI, and how were they involved? Can you explain that?
Sure. I mean, the Comey ran everything. So this was his personal little fiefdom. So James Comey's at the top, and then he's got his little right-hand man. That was Andrew McCabe, the deputy director. And then below those two, they had section chiefs who would do this or that. So the guy that everyone's heard of is this guy called Peter Strzok. And Peter Strzok was the head of counterespionage, and they put him in charge of this anti-Trump investigation because they knew they could trust him, and they knew that it would go exactly the way they were all on board with how this is supposed to go. Peter Strzok is the guy who was having an affair with Lisa Page, so everyone's heard of her as well. She was Andrew McCabe's personal, not personal. What's it called? She was his lawyer. She was the counsel of the deputy director. So she was daily with McCabe, dealing with all of that, and then the triangle gets completed because she's also in bed with Strzok. So you got a very interesting structure there. Now that's sort of and then they have investigators sort of on a higher level where agents, a guy called Priestap, a guy called Moffat.
Bill Priestap was head of counterintelligence. So in a sense, he was kind of like Peter Strzok's boss, right?
It's sort of not necessarily in this particular investigation, but yeah, I mean, in terms of the structure, you got Pientka, you got Soma, you got all kinds of people.
Okay, who's Pientka? Explain that.
Sorry?
Explain who Pientka is.
Oh, yeah. Joe Pientka was Peter Strzok's sidekick. I think he was just special agent or something. I don't quote me on what exact title he had, but sort of in the structure, he was under Strzok, but he was a sidekick, whom he would like bring him along everywhere, knowing that he would just toe the line, which he did. So, for instance, when they did the ambush interview of General Flynn, Strzok
at the White
brought
House,
Pientka.
yeah.
When they smeared the whole Papadopoulos story and they had to go to London and kind of set that all up, Strzok flew out to London and he brought Pientka. And Pientka allegedly later cried when Special Counsel John Durham told him that the whole thing was a hoax and that Strzok knew it was a hoax. And he claimed that Strzok never told him. And, I don't know how much I, believe all that. But the legal side, Clinesmith, and there was another lady called Sally Moyer. And of course, their boss of FBI legal at the time was this horrific guy called James Baker, who, I have no idea how he got to be the head, chief counsel or general counsel of the FBI, the whole legal unit. He's the guy they later parachuted into Twitter. They gave him a job at Twitter after he left the FBI, just so that he has a kind of a nice salary coming in. And he was the guy who was sabotaging Elon Musk after he bought Twitter, because he stayed on and started sabotaging things from the inside until Elon found out about this guy still being there, and then he fired him. So this is all the same guy. So he ran their legal, and then they were like below him were people like Sally Moyer, and below that were people like Kevin Clinesmith. So everything is in these kinds of structures and these pyramids, but ultimately they pick and choose the people I mean McCabe and Comey, the people they trust, they want to handle things, and then they run things. So one example, just to give an example, when we talked earlier about this whole the secret communications channel, the one between Trump and Putin, run by the Alpha Bank of Russia, all totally made up. The guy who initially was handed this file within the FBI is a guy called Scott Helson. Now, this guy, smart guy, honest guy, he immediately saw this as a total hoax, like within 2 milliseconds.
Yeah.
And he started texting he foolishly started texting some of his colleagues what a joke this is. Well, someone must have kind of told Comey or told McCabe or someone, because Helson was immediately taken off the task. And then they sent it to Chicago to some other people whom they knew they could trust, because those were the same people they had tasked with going after George Papadopoulos. So again, without kind of laying out the whole spider's web here, the point is that it's more than a handful of people. You're probably talking about, 10, 12 people or so, but they all know that they all want the same thing, which is to take down President Trump, and they're all going to do what's necessary, and they're all on different levels. They're not necessarily all on the so-called seventh floor. They might be out in Chicago, like I just mentioned, but they all know that what is expected, and they're all trustworthy within their little, group.
It's kind of like the mob in a sense, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if you've got a mess, you need it cleaned up, you call this guy.
Exactly right. They had a mob set up. That is exactly right. Including higher, middle, lower, the whole works of the whole spectrum of types of people there. And yet not one of them has been held to account. I mean, we talked about Clinesmith earlier, slap on the wrist, but nothing has happened to any of these people that we just talked about. Nothing whatsoever, apart from maybe losing their jobs. And by the way, Strzok wants his job back. He's suing for his job back.
The goal, right, of someone who knows, because of all the people, Strzok knows that he broke the law and that he's guilty of treason and sedition. I think it's U.S. Code 115, if anyone wants to look it up, 18 U.S. Code Chapter 115. What I want to ask you about, though, Hans, is that what was the role of the CIA in all of this? Because, John Brennan was head of the CIA. He made sure that this got into the congressional record. He was the one who walked this over to the White House, and he is the one who is still, according to a number of different intelligence sources that I've spoken to, he's still directing much of the subversion against President Trump. So can you take us through what you learned about the role that the CIA and the intelligence agencies have played in all of this?
Yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised if they initiated the whole thing, even back in 2015. Like, we can't have this guy Trump, and then maybe talk to some people in the Clinton campaign. We talked earlier about Jake Sullivan. I mean, John Podesta, we know he knew because we got his emails. We knew that Palmieri, the communications chief, she knew because, again, we saw the emails. So maybe there was some contact there. Like, hey, if you guys, here's an idea for your October surprise or for your, your smear against Trump next year, make it about Russia. And we have some stories lined up. Maybe that happened. We just don't know that happened. The earliest known thing that happened that involved the CIA was in July of 2016, when, as we talked about earlier, when the CIA found out, or they claim to have found out, they might have known earlier, that this was all a Clinton campaign hoax. And then things started getting really bad, because the first thing that John Brennan did was, instead of blowing it all up or telling Clinton to cut it out or anything like that, he set up what's called a fusion group, or he called a fusion group, where he brings in a bunch of analysts, a very small group. Again, just same as what we just talked about a few minutes ago. Trusted people, mafia that he knows they're going to do exactly what he says to sort of advance this Russia collusion narrative. Well, then, unfortunately for them, Trump still won. So then they escalated. So what Brennan did then, and this is together with Obama, this is one of the most horrible things they did. This was between when Trump won and when he was inaugurated. They created this thing called ICA, which is Intelligence Community Assessment. And what the assessment was for, it was meant to be this giant brick that they're going to hang around Trump's neck from day one, so that he is basically sabotaged from being effective as president from day one. Because the intelligence community assessment was meant to say and said that Trump only became president because of Putin. Putin made Trump president. In a nutshell, that's what it says. So to have concocted that is just absolutely just horrendous, horrific on every level. And for the sitting president to have done that to a successor, again, absolutely horrible. But John Brennan, CIA, they were the people who executed this plan. They were the ones who carried this out. They were the ones who drafted this totally fraudulent document, which, by the way, when you have a look at it, it's such a joke. It says, RT, the Russian TV news channel, once ran a bad story about Hillary Clinton. Therefore, Putin elected Trump. It's just such harebrained rubbish in there. The media, of course, says, no, there's a secret part that you haven't seen, and that's where all the juicy stuff is in. They always have a secret part so that they can make up these excuses. But, and as you rightly said, then Brennan attached the dossier to this ICA, which then legitimized it. And as soon as that was done, Jake Tapper ran with it, and then everyone ran with it. And then the whole kind of, we were all off to the races when that happened. So the CIA's role was to advance the Russia collusion narrative, more kind of at first more in the background, and then as soon as Trump won, very much in the foreground, really pushing it and trying to sabotage Trump's presidency, basically the whole way through.
It's very interesting because I was tracking in real time one of the other parts of this smear, which is that the weekend that Trump was inaugurated, before he even held his hand up and took the oath of office, those narratives that you talk about that the CIA was heavily involved in creating were contained in a document that was presented by Media Matters for America, which was run by David Brock, and it was presented to all these high-level Democrat donors at an event where one of the main themes was that Trump is an illegitimate president, and you had to invalidate him. And so if anyone in the media tried to normalize him or treat him as a president, they were to be targeted. If you were part, of the Democratic establishment and you treated Trump like a normal president, you were to be targeted. I mean, this was laid out along with every single line of attack. In terms of information warfare, every line of attack, every narrative that was going to be used against Trump was all laid out in this document that was leaked by the Washington Free Beacon very early on in Trump's presidency. And so you start to see how the different arms of this strategy are working together, because the Russia narrative was the foundation of the narrative that Trump was not legitimate. And because he wasn't legitimate, he could be undermined at every turn, then every decision that he made, because this was the moment. If you remember, up to this point, we never had a presidency where the executive authority of the president was completely and utterly overruled by the courts. This was the first time that had ever happened. I mean, typically, you might not like George Bush, and you might be unhappy that he won the election, but you lost, right? Your team lost. And so there's going to be a bunch of things he's going to do that you're not going to like. But right from the beginning of the Trump administration, the other pillar of the strategy, which was included in this document, right, which was the strategic plan of what the left was going to do in the wake of Trump's election, it included what? Citizens, CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in journalism, or in the public. I don't remember exactly what it stands for. But if you look up CREW, what were they? What has their role been? CREW, run by Norm Eisen. Do you know that name? I bet you do. Mm-hmm. So CREW run by Norm Eisen, and then David Brock from Media Matters drafted into CREW as well to run what? The legal strategy to undermine, or at least run a significant part. Norm Eisen has been hugely instrumental in this, running the lawfare, right, against not just the president, but against, for example, people like Rudy Giuliani, who was fired by his own law firm when he accepted Trump as a client, all the way through to the January 6th prosecutions, where you either have lawyers who are working against their own clients, or you have lawyers who are terrified to take on the case because they're going to get disbarred. So the pillars of this strategy were laid out. I mean, Russia collusion was critical to all of them, right? To all the rest of them, because it was the beginning point at which you could argue that Trump wasn't legitimate, that the election was stolen, that somehow the legitimacy of every single decision that he could make could legitimately be called into question, and then also challenged in the courts. And nobody dared to challenge the authority of the courts at that time. Because why? Because you were talking about, if it wasn't the Alpha Bank aspect of Russia collusion, then it was the Magnitsky meeting in Trump Towers, right? And then it was Michael Flynn, and then it was Carter Page, and then it was George Papadopoulos, and it just went on and on and on. And they exploited the information dominance that they had in the media. They exploited the people within the Republican Party and within Trump's own camp, or those who they'd managed to infiltrate into his cabinet. And they just kept it going to cripple him. Right?
Absolutely. And you've mentioned so many names of people working in the background that, people who don't watch shows like your show are probably not familiar. Certainly not. They wouldn't be familiar with those kinds of names like Norm Eisen from, the old corporate media. These people this is one of these underappreciated parts. Lawfare, Brookings, all that is a big part of that too. You have these operatives, or you still have them now, obviously, but we're talking now 2017, working very hard to set the ground for whatever is going to happen. So, for instance, in terms of what Mueller was supposed to do, people always say it was Mueller and his group, and that's true. And there were horrible, horrible people there, Andrew Weissman and all that kind of stuff. But had the lawfare people setting out the agenda. They were writing basically writing the memos for them, publishing them on their website
for what Mueller was supposed to find. Right?
Exactly. And down to the laws and sections and everything in great detail in terms of what they're supposed to do with this or that. And then in the run up to the 2020 election, they did the same in terms of all this, all these shenanigans with the ballots and this and that. All the groundwork was prepared by these groups. And then afterwards with January 6th and so on, same thing again. I mean, that awful woman in Atlanta, she didn't write all these, the legal briefs herself. She copied and pasted it from, and same for New York and all these fake cases against Trump. What they did is they just used the work done by Norm Eisen and his people, by the lawfare people.
Yes, they just took it I mean, Letitia James is dumber than a bag of rocks, right? And she's completely corrupt. So she doesn't come up with any of this herself. First of all, she's incapable of it. And secondly, they choose people like Letitia James because she is compromised. And so she has to do what they say. And they know that she's corrupt. So she's not going to mind when they come to her and they say, break the rules and do this and do our bidding. So that's who you mean by that stupid woman in Atlanta, right?
No, I meant Fanny. I meant Fanny. The Letitia is just as dumb.
Oh, yeah. Letitia is New York. And then there's another one. Who is it? Fanny, what's her name? Fanny Willis.
That's right.
Fanny Willis in Georgia, Letitia James in New York. I mean, who's in Michigan? There's another couple up in Michigan, right? There's Jocelyn Benson, who's the Secretary of State, who's just awful. And then there's the Jenna
the one in Colorado, Griswold, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
But
right, these people are just disgusting.
But you're so right. These are not the sharpest knives in the drawer by far.
They're so not. They're idiots.
But they get these outside groups doing that heavy lifting where they just have to copy and paste all the legal work.
Horrible, horrible, horrible people who literally don't care. They're so self-serving, and they're completely devoid of moral character and of moral courage. It's quite extraordinary. They'll just destroy lives at the drop of a hat. Couldn't care less.
Exactly.
And then once they're implicated, now they have a vested interest in keeping the lie and the conspiracy and the deceit going, right? And so now it doesn't matter whether they're ideologically committed or not, because if they don't go along with it, if they don't keep propping it up, if they don't, keep quiet, then they're done.
One of the things that might carry some fruit in future, and we'll see what happens, is exposing the U.S. aid fraud, which obviously happened earlier this year, where there's less slush fund money going around because all these groups that we mentioned that do all the heavy lifting, well, they rely on that kind of funding, as well as these dumbos who run these shows when they're not in office, they get like a slush fund here or there to, have a nice life. So we'll see what happens, whether any of that has an impact when it dries up. But my suspicion is they're just going to find novel ways of funneling that money to the people they want to funnel it to.
Well, you make an important point here. I have been hopeful as I watched that happening with USAID and the dismantling of the NGO industrial complex, right? This is a massive money laundering scheme that they instituted all the way back to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But it became something much more than that. I mean, the way I look at it is that the Brookings Institutes of the world and the WHOs and the WEFs and all the rest of it, they are like the federal government of this group of globalists who really want a world without borders that is run and controlled by them, right? And these NGOs really provide the local government infrastructure. They're the brown shirts and the enforcers. You take the most hapless people that you can find, you pour money into them, you corrupt them, or exploit their natural insecurities and corrupt tendencies. And now you have these loyalists that will do whatever you want. They'll do your bidding, and they don't. And they don't have to work very hard to get them to follow instructions because they're bought into this system. And then you can throw in a few other layers, right? Whether it's the layers of Antifa or the layers of like the International Lawyers Guild and the ACLU, who provide the legal cover for those that they care to protect for as long as they need them. But, I'm reminded, was it Yuri Brezhnev? I believe it was Yuri Brezhnev who said what none of these people realize is that when it's convenient for their political masters, for the puppet masters, they're the first ones that will be taken out back and lined up against a wall and shot because they are the weak link. They're the ones who've done the dirty work. And they can provide the evidence chain leading back to the people who ordered it. And so they're the first ones that have to go. And they're completely and utterly expendable. As you can see now, because what is it? Is it Fannie Willis who's going to go down for mortgage fraud and all the other corrupt things that she's done that they knew about, which made her a perfect person for them to pick, right?
Yeah, and Letitia James has her issues too, and of course Fannie Willis had the boyfriend issue, and they had all this funds, and I mean you're absolutely right. These people always have a lot of baggage, but that's on purpose. That's deliberate because that's how they control them.
So based on your investigations, Hans, what was it that you learned about that surprised you, that you didn't expect going in?
Maybe overall how little power the president actually has. As someone who had kind of just known about and followed Trump for my entire life, I was so excited, and then it actually happened. I mean, that year, I got to say, that year between June of 2015 and then the election in 2016 in November was just a magical time. I'm sure I'm not the only one who went through that. It's happening for real. It was just I look back to that time with, some of the best days, some of the best times ever, just fantastic. So much hope. And the first thing that I realized very quickly is how little the guy can actually affect. And then as you kind of peel back on the onion, you see more, exactly the kind of stuff you were just talking about. Okay, so everyone in the federal government is corrupt and they don't actually follow any orders and they always sabotage. Okay, well, what if we fire those people? Well, then there's a new level and then another one. Let's fire them all. Well, then we get to the NGO level. Then we get to the Norm Eisen level. What about all those? Well, then we get to the Antifas and on and on. It's like, it's kind of never ending. I think, and I think this can be said about most governments, especially Western governments, especially, having grown so hugely, basically since World War II. I mean, it's just growth, just the whole thing just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, a more recent example is European Union, just started off very small in Brussels, just kind of an office. They were always joking. I remember these times, I was studying, it's not that long ago when they were joking that the European Union had less staff than like the administration of a small town in France or in Belgium or wherever, so just as a comparison. Oh, it's just a small thing. And look where we are now, 20, 30 years later, it's this gigantic thing that kind of strangles all of Europe with regulations and this and that and whatever. And okay, I use that example because it's more recent where we can actually see what happened, but it happened everywhere, and it happened in the US. And you got to cut it down. You got to make it much, much smaller. You got to get rid of all these layers so that you get control back, because that's ultimately what we're talking about here. And you asked about the biggest surprise. It's how little control the president actually has in terms of the levers. You could pull the lever and then nothing happens because someone further down sabotages it. One of the only powers President Trump had in his first term, I felt at times, was the pardon power. Like when he signed the pardon, that actually happened. But it just felt like everything else didn't happen. How many times did he declassify some Russiagate stuff? I remember back in 2018, yay, we're getting Russiagate stuff. And then it never arrived because all the layers down, all the people down there just didn't comply. So again, zooming out here, I think that's what I found most surprising and disappointing and so on. And the solution has to be to cut government and to do it radically. And so that's a bit of a disappointment these past few months, that doing that is so difficult in and of itself as well.
Well, if you look though, I mean, where they have tried to cut government, they have run up against the same issues of lawfare that we talked about, right? So perhaps what that is demonstrating is that cutting government is not going to do it. That's not going to get us to where we really need. It's one of the important things that obviously needs to be done. I mean, I think back to something Mike Flynn said to me once, is that, as National Security Advisor, one of the big things that he was going to do was just, get rid of 70, 80% of the National Security Council. Because as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you get more infiltrated. It becomes harder to control security. And by the way, you don't actually need all those people. You can bring in specialists when you need them. So yes, cutting government is certainly important in terms of, very national security and other issues, right? Efficiency and so on. But doesn't it just reveal that behind cutting of government, behind this issue of the president supposedly not having very much power, you have the real problem? which is that the president does actually have extraordinary powers under the Constitution. It's laid out in black and white. It's very clear. The president could declare emergency powers, and he can actually, once emergency powers are declared, his term is suspended. And as long as those emergency powers and that sort of that ruling or that state is in place, that can be for as long as whatever conflict that is justifying the emergency war powers, is in place. He's able to be in office. So in theory, if you actually just follow the Constitution, there is the ability of any president, not just this one, under emergency war powers to suspend his time in office and be there for as long as it takes to deal with the domestic enemies that are colluding and conspiring with your foreign enemies to overthrow your government. I mean, what we're looking at is an undeclared covert war to overthrow the system of government that's in the United States in favor of another system. And so the issue is not that the president doesn't have the power. The issue is the president doesn't use the power.
Or can't use it. Maybe it's that he can't.
He can. What's stopping him using it is that what's stopping him from using it is exactly the same forces that are undermining his and subverting his presidency in the first place. You just have to have a president who's willing to do it, and who's put in place the people who are willing to do it. Because, I mean, you're not wrong. There's layers and layers of subversion that go from the bottom all the way to the top and all the way back down again. But he does have the power in appointed positions that don't go through Congress to put the right people in place to exercise those powers. I mean, I'm not a political consultant, right? I'm a journalist, but I can read. Anyone can read the Constitution and see it. The question is, why doesn't he do it? Or will he do it? I don't know the answers to that. I mean, I would never presume. I'm not in those meetings. I'm not in his mind. I don't know what other, considerations are in place. But like you said, I know what's verifiable. It's verifiable that the Constitution allows for special powers that are vested only in the President of the United States.
Well, and yet you have foreign policy powers, immigration powers. All these are very clearly vested with the president. And then as soon as he does something, the courts step in. Oh, he can't. Or you got to hire these people. And they're telling the military whom to hire. They're telling Jay Bhattacharya what projects to fund.
Because they've been allowed to get away with treason. Because they have not been charged.
Right. So then you get to the point, but ultimately many of these things get scuppered, and it's in particular in the past few months, it's the courts. The courts have done more damage than the Democrats, than the media, than all of the others combined. So for once, it's the courts. I'd say in Trump's first term, it was mainly the media, and now it's the courts that have done. Not that the courts didn't do damage in the first term, but I mean that's sort of the one that's certainly done the most damage.
Well, they had information dominance, and they no longer have it. So you don't see the same kind of power in the media. The courts have taken on a greater role this time.
No, that's absolutely right. But then what do you do about the courts? So one option is you get Congress to reorganize the courts, defund certain courts, create others. I mean, these are legislative issues, which they're not going to do, they haven't done. The other point is, well, do we have to always abide by whatever the court says? That one's a bit more tricky. I would actually say no, as long as you pretend to. You two can play that game kind of thing. So the court says, you gotta bring this guy back, or you gotta do this, or you can't hire this guy, or whatever. Or for instance, you remember the courts with the whole USAID, they were saying, no, you got to pay all the contractors and you got to have all these things and so on. There's so many cases over the past few months that I've even kind of lost an overview of all the stuff that's going on, but it always goes in the same direction where the courts micromanage. That's sort of, ultimately what's going on. Well, as I said, two can play at that game. So what you do, for instance, if the court says, no, you got to pay all these USAID, the contractors, the so-called NGOs, Well, then you do the administrative thing. You then say, well, okay, we'll pay, but there are lots of they have to tick a lot of boxes before we pay. We got to do a proper accounting of everything, and we got to do this and due diligence. We got to check, and you can hold it up, and you can do so much. But in order to do so much, it comes back to the people whom Trump appoints. You got to have the right people in all these positions across all these different agencies to do that, to play that same game that the courts are playing. And I don't think he has that team in place.
Or another option is that you can prosecute the judges that are conspiring, right, with other people like Boasberg. Don't tell me there isn't evidence that you don't have that doesn't tie Boasberg to a seditious conspiracy with the role that he has played in so many critical aspects of this along the way. And the question here, Hans, is you take down one Boasberg, one judge. How many of those other judges are going to be willing to fall on their swords?
Oh, absolutely.
How many of them are going to change their rulings very quickly to following the law instead of following the politics? How many, you take out John Brennan, if you hold, when I say take out, what I mean is you take him out of the operational control and command of the seditious conspiracy that's still underway, the revolution that's still underway. If you demonstrate to people that the guy who has protected them, who has put them in place, who has been running these operations, if according to multiple intelligence sources, right? If you hold him accountable, how many of them are going to then fold? How many of them will fall in line? How many of them will give each other up? I mean, it's not this big, impossible thing. This is what's so frustrating. It's impossible if you're not going to do it. It's impossible if you won't even take the first step. It's impossible if you won't use the power that you have. But it's kind of like over the years we became seduced into this idea that wars were unwinnable. It's an unwinnable war. No, every war is winnable. It's just, what are you prepared to do to win? What is the will of the people? Does the United States have the ability, for example, to blow up the Three Gorges Dam in China and obliterate 3/4 of China overnight? Yes, you could argue in the strictest sense, if you weren't factoring in the cost of human life, and the tragedy and the devastation, you could argue that war would be over very quickly. But who's prepared to do that? No one's prepared to do that. And you could argue for very good reasons, right? Because the cost of human life would be unacceptable. However, that doesn't mean that a war with China would have to be protracted. It doesn't mean it would be unwinnable. There's many things that you could do to win that war and bring it to a very quick conclusion. But you're never going to win. You're not even going to stand a chance if you're not in the ring, right?
We're not even asking for, just to come back to something we talked about earlier, just end the Mueller cases, just as a start, just do that, then just release the documents. It took them, there was this one bundle, this Russiagate binder, it took them like 4 months or so to release that from when Trump came in for his second term, even though the binder was ready. Everything could have been released on day one because it should have been released in his first term. Everything was there. Just release it. You're absolutely right. They just can't get it done. And I don't know why that seems to be so incredibly difficult. But knowing that they seem to find it very difficult, the chances of ever charging a judge or whatever are, next to zero.
Well, I am one of those who does believe in giving them grace and time. There's a lot of smart people that have been appointed. There's a lot of good people that have been appointed. I know Kash Patel to be a good person and smart and committed. I know Dan Bongino to be a good person and smart and committed. And I know some people will hear that and they'll say, but what about this? And but what about that? And why did they do this and that? And they have a right to ask those questions, and they have a right to question people. I hear a lot of people say bad things about Pam Bondi, but I hear other people say, you don't want to get on the wrong side of Pam Bondi, I see a lot of people going after Pete Hegseth, and there's some things taking place that you just know, knowing Pete Hegseth, you just know he wouldn't be okay with that. So I am still conscious of what I don't know. I think to me, it'd be the height of arrogance to assume that no one in the government knows anything, no one in the government under Trump is prepared to do anything. Nobody has any moral courage. Nobody understands exactly what's going on. Do you know what I mean? Because that's kind of what we're being asked to believe, that we all get it. You've got all these people out there, we all understand and we all know, but none of those people understand anything, or even those who do, they're not prepared to do anything about it. I have a hard time with that.
Yeah, me too.
And
I completely agree with you. At the same time, I wonder what it's going to take to get just some of these easy things done. Never mind the difficult ones. Let's just start with the easy ones. My guess is that it's just being sabotaged by the same old kind of types of people that we've been talking about here. That you put down a request for declassification, or you put down a request to end the Mueller cases, or to do this or to do that, and then someone says,
and they
there's
find
a process.
50 bureaucratic or legal reasons why it can't happen.
There's a process, and we have to go through the motions.
Have to follow the rules. Have to follow the process.
Give us a few weeks, and that my guess is that is what's going on right now.
I'm sure you're right about that. Maybe what else is going on is that there are bigger fish to fry in some cases.
Yeah,
and that I keep going back to George Washington and crossing the Delaware on Christmas Eve, when nobody knew that they were coming. And I think if people had known, we wouldn't be sitting here today, right? The history would have been completely different. And I keep coming back to that. If we knew what they were really doing, if we knew about every investigation, if we were discussing this in public, they wouldn't be very good at covert warfare, okay? And they wouldn't stand a chance. So I'm still holding out for the good guys. I'm still holding out that they're going to do the right thing, because I do think that this is very different. And what has been exposed is that we understood the role of the media, but now we really understand the role of the normizens and the lawfare and the courts, right? And so there is a lot being exposed here. And if you look at the LA riots, and you hear everybody talking about who's pulling the strings and who's behind the funding and who's organizing it all. When I was talking about those things in the George Floyd riots, everyone said, okay, well, you're a racist.
Yeah.
It's like, what? You say, Antifa is literally hiring young black kids and putting them in the front as human shields, hoping that they get hurt, so that it further fuels the narrative here and keeps this going. And when you say, now these people are being exposed. So I mean, we've traveled a long way, but exposure alone isn't going to cut it, right? And so that's a lot of the frustration of many people out there.
I completely agree with you. And there are some people I can name here where I know in my heart, these are good people who want to make this work and who will try everything. We mentioned Jay Bhattacharya. We mentioned Kash Patel. We mentioned Dan Bongino. I have no worries whatsoever that these people have turned, or, whatever, all this kind of stuff that people are being accused of. Absolutely not. These are fantastic people. But obviously that it's not as easy as maybe we would have hoped, and even for some of the simple things. Again, I'm not expecting like huge miracles or whatever, but just the simple things seem to be very, very difficult. I mean, poor Jay Bhattacharya, he had a walkout he did a town hall, which he doesn't have to do, for his own staff. And then they walked out because he deigned to say that COVID might have come out of a lab. He was so careful in what he said, and yet they all got up and walked out. It was absolutely horrendous. And then I'm like, oh God, that guy has to work with these people day in, day out. So I understand all that. The point, and so I'm still optimistic, and I know these are good people, and there's more than them. But I think if we get to the point where, say, Dan Bongino goes, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to go back to my radio show, then we know we're in trouble, because
that'd be a bad sign. Yeah, for sure. So Hans, you are an interesting man. You're not American. And you have lived all over the world. You've been coming to this country. You spend a lot of time here. And you have a very interesting history. I know you said that you don't like to stay in a place too long because you get bored. You've lived in my native South Africa. You've lived all over the world, but you were born in Iran. Is that right?
Well, technically, my parents met in Iran. I was technically not born there, which I'm very grateful for. And actually, this was very prescient. I mean, the way I was told the story was like, well, you would have problems later in your life if that had happened. So my I don't think my dad even joined. It was like just, my mom just flew out. So I was not born in Iran, but I was back when I was like 2 weeks old or whatever. So
so your parents were living there. Your mom flew out to have you and then came back.
Correct. Yeah, and I still have some memories of Iran. It was but this was pre-revolution. It was very very good, very nice place, very good place. By the way, so someone else I would have, if we'd stayed longer, I would have ended up in the same school as Peter Strzok.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, he went to the American school in Tehran.
I did not know that. That's fascinating. So how old were you then when you were at that school?
I was not at that school. If we'd stayed longer, then
if you had stayed there, because you left when you were what, like 11?
No, we left when I was like 4 or 5, something like that.
I see.
I think Peter Strzok's probably like 5 or so years older than me, something like that. So, but I know he was at that school. So, I mean, the American community was huge back then in Tehran. By the way, all of that, all of the stuff was appropriated illegally by the Iranian regime. Not many people talk about that. The property, everything that Americans had there. There was a long process in the 80s of trying to get it back and so on. But when people talk about Iran, there's a long history there. It's not a problem that started this week or last week.
No, and of course Jimmy Carter didn't make things better.
The way the grown-ups always told the story. I mean, I was too young to remember any of these things, but the way the grown-ups always told it that I can remember, because I mean, we eventually had to leave. Many people had to leave. We stayed in touch, many friends and so on. Many still to this day. Some ended up in the US, some ended up in England. I mean, all over the place. Anyway, the way that the story was always told to me was that Jimmy Carter ruined it. It was Jimmy Carter because he decided he was going to kind of make an example out of the Middle East, like we're going to democratize the Middle East sort of thinking. And he chose the wrong country because he put a lot of pressure on the Shah back then to do all those things. But the Shah himself was trying to straddle all these different the mullahs were always there, right? It's not that they didn't suddenly sort of appear. He had a lot of different people pulling a lot of different directions, had to keep it all kind of under control. And so to have Jimmy Carter come in and interfere, mess around, the same kind of topics we're talking about nowadays. Get rid of the Shah,
basically.
And then destabilize the Shah, and then the whole thing collapsed.
And then the mullahs seized power.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. So where did your mother fly to give birth to you?
She flew to Germany without speaking a word of German. I still feel so bad for her having to have gone through that.
Wow. And have you spent time in Germany?
My grandmother, I mean, I used to visit her. She was in near Hamburg. Europe is I don't know. I spent a lot of time in Holland. I did my PhD in Switzerland, so I mean I'm fairly familiar with Europe, but it's sort of I don't know, it's a dying continent, I find.
Well, then you ended up as a professor at a university in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I did. That was
lovely.
And
what were you teaching?
I was teaching just all kinds of law, whatever they needed. No, that was fantastic. That was a very, very nice experience. So this was a university that taught all across the Caribbean. It's sort of a pan-national, international type of university for the Caribbean, and just fantastic. And also met some of the most amazing people there, like some of the brightest, certainly, actually the brightest people I've ever taught were in the Caribbean. Now, of course, the cream of the crop goes to this university because that's the local university there. There aren't any other ones. So, and the people who can make it and through grades and so on, they end up there. So maybe there was some sort of filtering going on, but just absolutely amazing people. And beyond that, I mean, just not just the students. I mean, just a very, very interesting part of the world. But by the way, so South Africa, I spent many years there too, like you did.
When you were growing up.
Yeah. This is pre, the changes. I mean, so during apartheid, and then going towards the changes, and then we moved again. So I wasn't there for the whole Mandela thing. I actually was. We lived just down the road from Elon Musk's school, the Bryanston High School. I was too young. I wasn't at that school. I was at a different school. But I always remember walking past there, and that was the one I was going to go to. They had these green uniforms if I was going to stay there. You remember, it was just a very, you had space. You had a big garden. You had all these lovely things. The schools every school had a swimming pool and a football pitch and this and that. I mean, just space. I remember space, lots and lots of space, and obviously fantastic weather, and just a very lovely experience. But of course, as a kid, you don't really take in all this apartheid, and you don't really understand those things.
No. It's Bryanston, of course, being in Johannesburg, and So okay, so this is a long way where you are today. Having written this book, Swift Boating America, and being one of the key people to unravel what happened in the Russia collusion. Seditious conspiracy, really. I bet you didn't expect to be here where you are now.
Absolutely not. I was, as I mentioned, I was very happily ensconced in the Caribbean. Just everything was kind of perfect. I thought, maybe I can actually settle down somewhere. I basically moved every 2-3 years, kind of my entire life, always somewhere else. And then Trump decided to run. And as I mentioned earlier, it was such a huge thing. It was just one of those few moments in life where you just go, yep, it's actually happening. And I believed from day one. I was one of those people who thought, yep, this is going to happen. He's going to make this happen. He will bend reality the way he wants to. By the way, there's a very interesting story about Trump that when I found out many, many years ago, like 20 whatever years ago. But when I found out, I knew that this is going to, not necessarily that he's going to be president, but I kind of knew where he gets his power from. His pastor was a guy called Norman Vincent Peale. That was his actual pastor, the actual church where he went to every Sunday. I fell off my tree when I found out. Norman Vincent Peale is the guy who wrote the book, The Power of Positive Thinking, which is one of the most important books anyone could ever read. And I wish I'd read it when I was like 10. And wow. I don't remember when I did actually read it, but I would give it to every child, everyone. It's such an absolutely fantastic book. And he describes how you can form reality the way you want it to be. That's what the book is about. And then when I found out that this was Trump's actual pastor, so Trump hadn't only read the book, he knew the guy. When I found that out, I knew, okay, this is where he gets his superpower from. So I was very familiar with Trump. I had followed him a long time and so on. And he ran, and I just, everything looked really rosy and very positive. And this whole Russiagate thing started basically right after he came in and when he was inaugurated. And we talked about earlier about the Steele Dossier, what a total fraud that was from day one. And I was like, why isn't this going away? Everyone should see it for what it is. And then it got worse and worse. I mean, they got the Mueller Inquisition, and then they went after all these people, General Flynn, Papadopoulos, everyone. Papadopoulos was a big one in kind of my learning curve, because that was the first time we actually had court documents, because they had to charge him with stuff. And I read the court documents, like, this isn't true. They just made it up. Why is he pleading guilty to something that he didn't do? None of it made sense. So, of course, that piqued my interest. And then it was just one of these things where I got more and more and more into it.
Yes, it's disgraceful what they did to George Papadopoulos. And why do people plead guilty? I mean, look at all the January 6s. They plead guilty because they have the full weight of the Justice Department coming down on them. And it's very, very difficult to withstand that. And they just obliterate people in their path. I think you can hear, studio, come here, honey. I have my studio dog who's been barking here during the, come here, buddy. Hello. And just to close out, Hans, there she is. Why are you barking? Don't bark. Okay, so as a final question to close out the interview, I guess since we talked about the fact that much of this is not over, who are the people that you see having operated, being part of Russia collusion, who are still engaged in this subversive sort of activity, who you think are most important to be held accountable, and what are you concerned about going forward?
I'm most concerned about not only holding people accountable, but getting the information. It's just taken so long, and there's been so little coming out that I sometimes feel we're not going to get the information. I think in that order, Obama, Brennan, Comey, not only being masterminds and pulling a lot of strings and doing a lot of horrible things, but still doing it, still in some capacity that we're not seeing. And yeah, unfortunately, not only have they never been held to account, the stuff they did has never been explained. Most people just, we talked about it on your show just now, but most people just don't know any of those things. Most people don't know that Barack Obama knew the whole thing was a hoax before it even started, and he let it continue with all the national security implications, namely that you then had a president who was supposedly tied to Russia, which then crippled diplomacy and sabotaged everything, all that kind of stuff. Well, Obama knew from the start, Not only has he not been held to account, no one even knows that he knew from the start. And of course, Brennan and the whole CIA involvement, all these documents that have been released, again, is something else that's not widely appreciated or probably not known at all. You will hear these fanfares about, the Russiagate binder is out, or they released the interview of this Nellie Orr or Bruce Orr, whatever, just all these characters, all this stuff coming out. Great. You know what's never, ever come out? Nothing at all whatsoever, apart from one tiny little paragraph to do with Obama knowing about the whole thing? CIA documents. We have no CIA documents whatsoever. So my biggest sort of fear is that we're just not only are we not going to get accountability, that I think is not going to happen, especially since we already passed the 5-year time limit for bringing charges. And yeah, I know treason doesn't fall under that, but that seems to be kind of too far gone now. But at least let's have some transparency. And my fear is we're not even going to have that.
Well, I would agree with you that transparency and the whole truth is absolutely critical. And I think that's important to remind people that while they knew the truth, people like John Brennan were going on television, going on CNN, going on NBC and MSNBC and so on, saying that Trump was a Russian spy, that he was working for Vladimir Putin. Don't forget James Clapper, right? He's another person in all of this. And then there's all the people who controlled and ran Fusion GPS. There's Bruce Orr at the Justice Department, whose wife you just mentioned, Nellie Orr, who was the Russia specialist that was hired by the Clinton campaign through Fusion GPS to be sort of their Russia person. There's all these people within the Justice Department that were heavily involved that we haven't even gotten to talking about. And there's all those people who were happy to go out on television, on national television, and paint Trump and his administration as a Russian spy and destroy the lives of people like Carter Page. What they did to Carter Page, who helped the FBI put other Russian spies behind bars. Well, not behind bars, but get them convicted. They avoided their sentences, I believe. At least some of them did. But he actually worked with the FBI to prosecute Russian spies. And then they accused him of being a Russian spy. And they only had the right man to accuse because he had helped them. A man who served his country, who also was assisting the CIA. And these are the people that they destroyed. And that's why I'm more optimistic than you. I am not going to stop. It's going to be one of those things. I'm going to keep reporting on it, keep pushing for full accountability and for the whole truth. And I really look forward. I know, Hans, we're going to be talking again. I learned so much from you and from Swift Boating America. It's a very important book. I really would encourage people to read it. You didn't ask me to promote it. I'm not saying it because you are trying to sell your book. I'm saying it because it is really important for people to understand what happened here. And hopefully that will get people demanding more answers. So you take care of yourself and be safe. And we look forward. I'll be following you on X. Is there anywhere else you want people to follow you?
No, X is kind of I keep it simple. I don't do the whole social media kind of palette.
Yeah.
It's really just X. Keep it simple. Thanks so much for, having me on. I'm a big fan of yours going back, 20, 25 years. So
Wow,
when I
thank
got
you.
the call from your producer to come on your show, I was just so honored. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, I've wanted to talk to you for a long time, and I really appreciate everything that you've done, Hans, and I don't think it's going to be a waste. I think this whole thing is going to come apart. But, I'm just a journalist, right? I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, so I can be wrong again. Thank you, huh? You take care.
Thank you.
That's Going Rogue with Lara Logan. Thanks for watching this episode. Please, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe. Send this to as many people as you can. And if you want, support our work and independent journalism. I'm Lara Logan. Thank you.